picking up from our last discussion on the practical application of assumptions in religious life, let's zoom out a bit and look at the man himself, Emile Durkheim. Now we often think of him as this lone genius, the towering figure of sociology. But hold on a second. The text argues he wasn't just an individual, he was the very symbol and real head of a whole social movement. Think about it, his work wasn't cooked up in isolation. It was a collective effort, something modern sociologists recognize. Yet we tend to forget when we get starstruck by our intellectual heroes. We elevate them, almost deifying them, instead of appreciating the actual collective achievements. This raises a fascinating question. Why do we crave these individual emblems so much? It's like needing a sociology of how these intellectual icons are built and maintained. Okay, so how did this collective production actually happen? Level 1 is pretty straightforward. They were laser-focused on creating the Année Sociologique, that annual review journal, and using it as a launchpad for building a scientific sociology. This wasn't just casual collaboration. We're talking serious teamwork, co-authoring papers, intense editorial wrangling, strategizing their intellectual attacks on other fields, divvying up research tasks, compiling results, actively recruiting new members into the fold, and making crucial decisions about whose work got published under the Durkheimian banner and whose didn't. Their big idea was to showcase the best collective scholarship available and mold it into something entirely new, a proper science. They saw themselves as the inner circle, the core team, taking contributions from a wider network of proto-sociologists and collectively forging them into clear general principles. It was a deliberate, organized effort to build something bigger than any single person. Now, things get even more interesting at level 2. Within this inner circle, there was a real culture of shared responsibility and mutual support. When you look at their collaborations, it's honestly tough to untangle who came up with what specific idea. It wasn't like assigning patents or Oscars. The usual way historians track influence, drawing neat lines from A to B, just doesn't quite work here. You'd end up with a scoreboard where everyone has tiny fractions of credit for everything. This isn't meant to diminish individual brilliance, but rather to highlight how a consciously organized group could generate sustained creative energy. It shows us that sometimes the magic happens not just in solitary genius, but in the friction and synergy of a well-oiled intellectual machine. But wait, there's another layer. Level 3 takes us deeper into the weeds of how thought itself is socially constructed. Durkheim himself, drawing on his work with Mauss on classification and his earlier collaborations with Hubert on religion, plus influences from the French and German neo-Kantians and the burgeoning field of comparative ethnography, laid out a theory in the elementary force of religious life. He argued that not only broad categories of thought are shaped by society, but even the specific thinking an individual does at any given moment is socially constructed. Think about it, where do intellectuals hang out? With other intellectuals. Their social world is this buzzing network of ideas, debates, and projects. So on this level, the individual reappears, but not as some lone wolf genius. Instead, it's the individual embedded within these specific groups, absorbing ideas, forming projects, and getting energized by the collective intellectual climate. It's about how individuals become nodes in a network of circulating concepts. This leads us to what the author calls a sociology of thinking. It's all about how we form coalitions in our minds, bringing together ideas that feel like they belong to certain intellectual tribes. These ideas, especially in the Durkheimian context, become charged with emotional energy and moral weight. Think of those powerful symbols or theories that make you feel strongly connected to a group. Individuals who sit right at the center of networks buzzing with these charged idea emblems get super energized. This is how you get those incredibly dedicated, hard-working figures like Durkheim himself, who consciously take charge of projects, driven by a vision of what can be achieved. So, while Level 2 dissolves individuals into the movement, Level 3 shows how individuals still get spotlighted, how they occupy attention space, and how those powerful collective ideas often find their most forceful expression through particular individuals. The dynamic between Durkheim and Mauss is a perfect example of this interplay. Alright, let's rewind a bit and look at the historical backdrop. Where did this movement spring from? Primarily, a massive shift in the French educational system. Across Western Europe, there was this push in the late 19th century to modernize education, inspired by the German model of research universities, think labs, seminars, professors rewarded for discovery. France had its own unique situation. A powerful alliance between the state and the Catholic Church initially resisted this change. Intellectuals like Renan and Taine championed secular, German-style scholarship. Then came the Franco-Prussian War defeat in 1870, which really lit a fire under French nationalism, and the drive to catch up with Germany through educational reform. Enter Jules Ferry, the leading voice for secular education. He became Minister of Public Instruction, fought battles to remove Jesuits from schools, and eventually established free, compulsory elementary schooling. The École Normale Supérieure, the top teacher training school, was a hotbed of this reformist energy, producing future leaders like Durkheim, Bergson, Jaurès, Binet, Janet, and Lévy-Bruhl. Durkheim himself started his career plugged into this reform movement, literally following the career paths of key administrators like Liard and Buisson, moving from Bordeaux to Paris. So, this educational reform wasn't just about changing schools. It was a golden opportunity to create entirely new academic disciplines. Think about it. If you're setting up a new field, you need a clear identity, a unique selling proposition. You need grand theories, ambitious programs. This is why the founding generation of any new discipline is always theoretically intense. And there were tons of contenders vying for space alongside sociology, psychology, anthropology, criminology, political science, you name it. It wasn't just about copying the Germans. Local French academic politics played a role too. Durkheim, being deeply involved in this, had to define sociology clearly. His answer? Social facts, those patterns of social interaction that have a life of their own and constrain individuals. This was his way of saying sociology is distinct from psychology, and importantly, not just biology or economics. It was about showing sociology could explain fundamental things, like how the economy rests on pre-contractual social ties rooted in ritual exchange. This idea of distinct disciplinary methods, heavily influenced by the neo-Kantian philosophers Durkheim studied in Germany, became central to defining sociology's unique contribution. Beyond academia, there were major political currents pulling French intellectuals. Socialism was a big one, attracting many academics drawn to its ideals, often through the Radical Socialist Party. Early sociology even had socialist leanings, focusing on organic society and critiquing capitalism. Then came the massive Dreyfus affair, the scandal over Captain Dreyfus's wrongful conviction for treason. This became a huge rallying point. Durkheim and his colleagues were fierce Dreyfusards. It turned into a national showdown between secular, scientific, and reform-minded forces versus conservative elites and spiritualists. This affair really forged the image of the engaged intellectual, someone committed to ideas and politics. Politically, it paved the way for a Republican government, led to the separation of church and state in 1905, and directly contributed to Durkheim finally getting that coveted chair in Paris. It was a pivotal moment, linking political passion with academic ambition. But this wasn't a smooth ride. There were tensions simmering beneath the surface. Durkheim himself often clashed with his nephew Mauss, urging him to focus less on political activism and more on the core scholarly work. While socialism offered vision, Durkheim worried it was too narrow, too tied to immediate politics, potentially undermining sociology's goal of being a general science of all society. The worker-focused, conflict-oriented aspects of socialism also clashed with Durkheim's emphasis on social solidarity as the key theme. Furthermore, there were rival intellectual camps. The Laplace school, focusing on family economics, seemed too narrow. Alfred Espinas, studying animal societies and tech evolution, was initially friendly but later drifted apart. Worm's International Institute of Sociology tried international collaboration, but was too eclectic and lacked a strong academic base. Gabriel Tarde, famous for his laws of imitation based on crime statistics, was influential but remained an isolated figure, pushing Durkheim indirectly by highlighting the differences. Even when Isoulet won a chair, he lacked a movement. What's crucial here is that despite these rivalries and internal debates, the Durkheimian movement successfully carved out a niche for a generalizing, explanatory sociology that could resonate globally. How did they build this movement? Networks were key. It started close to home, Durkheim's family. His nephew, Marcel Mauss, lived with him during his studies in Bordeaux, right when Durkheim was really shaping his sociology. Mauss became Durkheim's confidant, assistant, and eyes and ears in the Parisian intellectual scene. Durkheim even used family ties to keep Mauss on track, sending affectionate but firm letters. The recruitment pool was broad, fresh graduates from the ends buzzing with reformist energy, young researchers eyeing new academic opportunities, socialists, Dreyfusards. Interestingly, Jews were prominent. likely because secularism aligned with their aspirations for assimilation and mobility in the new republic. And don't forget the publishing world. Publishers like Felix Alkan were betting on new social sciences, backing Durkheim's work. Journals like the Revue Philosophique, edited by Ribot, published early pieces, and the Revue de Métaphysique et de Morale became another key venue, helping recruit figures like Bouglé and Lapie into the fold. The real engine room for crystallizing this movement was the Année Sociologique. Think of it as the Durkheimian equivalent of a think tank or a flagship journal. It emerged alongside other publishing initiatives, but became central. The initial team included Moses' buddies Huber and Millot, plus figures like Simeon Lévy, Lapie, Bouglé, Richard. Later Hertz and Halbachs joined. They jokingly called themselves the Durkheimian Equipe, though it was more of a collaborative group than a strict hierarchy. This journal wasn't just a publication outlet, it was a crucible for the movement. It was where they published their big ideas, their major research, and it fostered a strong sense of group identity and creative energy. It wasn't just about promoting Durkheim, it was about building sociology as its own distinct program, its own intellectual force. What made the Année Sociologique special methodologically? Its big claim to fame was building general theory through empirical comparison and synthesis. They aimed to review the entire world literature in social sciences, books and articles. And these weren't just book reviews. As Durkheim told Mauss, just saying a book is bad is a waste of paper. Reviews needed to be analytical, digging into the work. They favored empirical studies that could be used to build theory over abstract philosophical musings. This massive undertaking served two purposes. First, it showed that sociology wasn't just armchair speculation or ideology. It had a solid empirical foundation, even if it wasn't fully institutionalized yet. Second, the very act of comparing all this material forced them to think at a high level of generality. It was like the intellectual version of organic solidarity, different parts working together to create a coherent whole. Interestingly, the later series in the 1920s dropped this ambitious global synthesis goal, becoming more focused on publishing their own work as an established group. Let's look at the first phase of their intellectual development. Riding the wave of educational reform and the excitement around new disciplines, Durkheim started ambitious. He used materials similar to his predecessors like Spencer and Schaefler, but framed society as an organism evolving through differentiation. To stand out from psychology, he attacked utilitarian views of cooperation. Drawing on his socialist sympathies, he argued forcefully for the primacy of pre-contractual solidarity over deliberate contracts, challenging traditional social contract theory. He didn't just use the organism analogy, he refined it into a theory explaining varying degrees of group solidarity. Embracing the scientific spirit, he collected data and tried comparative tests. In Division of Labor, he linked social morphology, population size, and density to collective sentiments measured by law punitiveness and individuality. He also tackled religion, arguing it evolved through stages of the collective conscience, countering conservative fears that secularization meant no morality, showing instead a more inclusive, humanitarian morality was emerging. Then came a shift around the mid-1890s. Durkheim found a new powerful data source, the contemporary legal system. His rules of the sociological method wasn't just abstract principles, it was a demonstration. Using criminology, he attacked biological and psychological explanations of crime. His famous argument, punishment reminds society of itself, even in a hypothetical society of saints, imperfections would still be punished. Right after this, suicide hit the shelves. At the time, the most theoretically sophisticated use of government statistics. Durkheim felt his program wasn't fully accepted, so he doubled down. Why study suicide? Because it reveals the opposite, the conditions under which life feels meaningful. It was another proof of how social structure shapes consciousness. This period really crystallized the Durkheimian approach, using seemingly paradoxical statements to break through common sense and expose the underlying social forces. Despite this intellectual fireworks, he was passed over for a prestigious Collège de France chair in 1897, leading to a brief dip in morale. However, the momentum of the Année Sociologique project kept going, and religion started becoming increasingly central, perhaps pushed by his collaborators as much as by Durkheim himself. Why did religion suddenly become so important? Well, Durkheim's earlier focus on social morphology had a problem. It was too close to what geographers, biologists, and demographers were already doing. Think of Adolphe Coste, who was publishing similar ideas about social evolution and ideology linked to population density. And his use of crime statistics was overshadowed by Tard's fame. Religion, however, was different. It was a hot topic, popular with works like Fraser's Golden Bough, appealing to a cosmopolitan audience looking for alternatives to Christianity. Crucially, it was under-theorized. Most discussions were speculative about origins or psychology, not about religion as a general social phenomenon. Robertson Smith's work, emphasizing religion as social practice, resonated strongly. Religion fit perfectly because it allowed studying social interaction in rituals, linking it directly to social constraint, moral sentiment, and ideas. It showed how social action connects to collective representations, opening the door to a theory of symbolism. Comparative religion offered rich, underexplored territory, promising careers not just in religious studies but in anthropology and the study of secular rituals. This focus on religion basically guaranteed the long-term success of the Durkheimian movement. And this sociology of religion wasn't just Durkheim's solo project, it was genuinely collective. Mauss and Henri Huber, a friend with historical training, really kicked things off with their groundbreaking work on sacrifice in 1899, applying Robertson Smith's ideas. Their later work on magic in 1902 to 1903 was even more influential, highlighting how emotions spread socially, how status differences emerge, and how objects get imbued with collective significance. Magic even shed light on the origins of money, tracing it back to the circulation of objects believed to carry magical power and thus prestige. The publication of Durkheim's magnum opus, The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, in 1912, was essentially a summary of 15 years of work by the entire movement. After arriving in Paris in 1902, Durkheim's focus shifted to consolidating these gains. His Sorbonne chair wasn't just for him personally, it was for him as the symbolic head, the taboo totem of the triumphant movement. But even the strongest movements eventually fade. Post-World War I France saw a decline in the Durkheimian movement's intellectual vigor. It wasn't a complete collapse, nor did it simply become routine bureaucracy. Instead, it lost its ambitious edge, shifting from a grand vision of sociology as a universal science to a more limited traditional role. Their earlier successes in academic policy and national politics actually backfired later, as younger intellectuals scorned them as a biased, outdated sect. Some might blame the war killing off promising young members like Hertz and David, but the text argues that's too simplistic. The real issue was failing to recruit new blood, especially from the elite-ness in the 1920s. Why? Because their institutionalization, while creating positions, left them somewhat marginalized and forced compromises that diluted their original message. This reduced their impact and visibility, ending the period of high anticipation. So how was sociology institutionalized in France? Barely. Only 4 chairs existed with sociology in the title, scattered across Bordeaux, Strasbourg, and the Sorbonne. These were tucked away in the Faculty of Letters, separate from economics in the Faculty of Law. Most importantly, sociology was taught primarily to philosophy students, mostly by philosophers. Initially, it was seen as cutting-edge, modern, even destined to replace philosophy, as Mauss claimed. But the perception shifted. Sociology started looking like a type of idealist philosophy, an antidote to materialism and class conflict, and a secular alternative to religion in the newly secularized school system. The focus subtly changed from social morphology to how interaction patterns generate emotions, moral sentiments, and sustain symbols, particularly emphasized in elementary forms. Figures like Bouglé played a role in softening the original scientific, research-driven emphasis, framing sociology more as moral teaching about group values, respect for institutions, and French patriotism. This led to a split. On one side, the academically influential Durkheimians were often caught in the French centralized education system, pursuing careers through inspectorships and administration. Their focus leaned towards publishing textbooks rather than conducting original research. They tended to uphold the Radical Party's moderate stance and Bouglé's more diluted program. On the other side, the more theoretically inclined Durkheimians found homes in specialized research institutes outside the main teaching structure. They resisted the shift towards idealism and patriotism, even opposing moves to introduce sociology into school curricula. Politically, these groups often diverged too, with the academics aligning with the radicals and the researchers leaning socialist or internationalist. Publicly, the nationalist, spiritualist image of the Durkheimians dominated. Younger intellectuals saw them as fanatical patriots responsible for the horrors of W1. Their anti-Germanism looked dogmatic against the rising tide of German thought like phenomenology and existentialism. Sartre famously declared Durkheim dead, rejecting the idea of social facts as separate entities. It seems that too much political success, ironically, damaged the reputation of an intellectual program aiming for universal relevance. If the future of the Durkheimian movement was to survive, it had to look beyond France. The United States became crucial. American universities embraced sociology as an independent department early on, expanding rapidly throughout the 20th century. Unlike France, American academic culture combined teaching and research, fostering a research environment conducive to the Durkheimian program. However, American sociology wasn't monolithic. It drew from various streams, including German imports, American pragmatism, evolutionism, and reform movements. The Durkheimian approach was just one part of this diverse landscape, initially not the dominant theoretical force. That changed in the 1930s and 40s with Talcott Parsons and Robert Merton, who developed structural functionalism, essentially reviving and amplifying the Durkheimian core. This set the stage for later sociologists to ensure the Durkheimian legacy endured even as functionalism faced challenges. There were also earlier sparks elsewhere, like the Turkish sociologist Gökalp, applying Durkheimian ideas to nationalist reform. But there was a risk. Adapting Durkheim's ideas of national solidarity as a secular religion for nationalist politics risked sacrificing the universal scientific aims of sociology for particularistic goals, potentially damaging its moral standing. Meanwhile, across the Channel, British social anthropology provided another lifeline for the Durkheimian program. British anthropology was transitioning from studying myths and origins to holistic fieldwork understanding societies in their entirety. Bronislaw Malinowski, returning from his famous Trobriand Islands research, set up a seminar at the London School of Economics. His approach resonated with Durkheim's concern for systematic explanation based on social structure, although he wasn't personally a fan of the Durkheimians. Malinowski's work, particularly his book on the Kula ring exchange, provided the empirical basis for Mauss's iconic work The Gift. Malinowski's seminar became a hub, attracting converts like Evans Pritchard and Meyer Fortis, who conducted pioneering fieldwork in Africa. They demonstrated how kinship, religion, and economy interlocked, viewing religion not as archaic belief but as practical action navigating social life. Anthropology gained prestige in Britain, filling a vacuum sociology didn't occupy there. A.R. Radcliffe Brown, another field researcher connected to Mauss through correspondence, further developed this into a clear structural functionalist program, emphasizing the functions of social ritual. He took the Oxford Chair in 1937, effectively consolidating this new anthropological movement, which was deeply indebted to Durkheimian ideas. So, how did this British anthropological blend get back into sociology? Two main routes: one was importing it to the US. The other was expanding the scope of anthropology to study modern societies, leading to a microsociology of rituals. Let's follow the first path to Talcott Parsons. In the late 1920s, Parsons was a young economist at Harvard, visiting the Malinowski seminar at LSE. Seeing the opportunity at Harvard to establish a top-tier sociology department, he realized sociology could claim intellectual prestige by emphasizing its role as the generalizing science of society. He recognized the Durkheimian strand within British anthropology as having broad applicability beyond tribal societies. Parsons essentially led a movement back to Durkheim, but through the lens of structural functionalism. While influenced by others like Weber and Pareto, it was the Durkheimian framework that gave his program its grand scope. His landmark book, Structure of Social Action, argued for sociology's centrality, with its analytical core firmly rooted in Durkheim's work, particularly his solution to the Hobbesian problem of order: how pre-contractual solidarity enables stable societies. Parsons used Durkheim as a weapon against reductionist explanations, contrasting his focused approach with Pitirim Sorokin's sprawling, eclectic survey of sociological theories. Parsons' work revitalized the Durkheimian program, positioning it as the clearest path for sociology to understand fundamental problems and offer solutions. He showed how Durkheimian insights about non-utilitarian solidarity could explain social change, building on Weber and adapting Durkheim's ideas about institutional differentiation. With a powerhouse institution like Harvard behind him, sophisticated theoretical tools, and a sense of carrying forward the classics, Parsons' movement produced a whole generation of leading sociologists, including his star student Robert Merton. Merton took these ideas to Columbia, developing a theory of deviance based on anomie and promoting the comparative methodology of the suicide study as a model for analyzing survey data. But ironically, the very success of this structural functionalist Durkheimian program set the stage for its next major crisis and decline in the 1960s. The 1960s brought a surge in sociologists and universities, and with it a wave of criticism against functionalism. Microsociology branches like symbolic interactionism, ethnomethodology, and rational choice theory gained traction. Macro-level conflict theories, including Marxism and neo-Weberian approaches emphasizing struggle, also rose. Functionalism was criticized as conservative, ignoring conflict and change. Some found its theoretical machinery clumsy or circular. Its reliance on treating societies as closed, self-reproducing systems looked less convincing for complex modern societies. Researchers increasingly preferred analyzing interest groups like classes or genders as the starting point. From a Durkheimian perspective, the weakness was the Hobbesian problem. How do these interest groups even form stable units capable of collective action? How does the larger social order provide the resources for these groups to mobilize? And how do moral appeals and cultural understandings function as weapons in conflict? The response from the Durkheimian camp was to move micro, focus on how groups achieve solidarity through ritual performance and social structure, even within oppressive macro systems. This micro-Durkheimian approach found expression in several key figures. Lloyd Warner studied a Massachusetts city, finding it organized into class tribes, each with its own rituals and symbols. Symbolic practices unified insiders and excluded outsiders. Prestige hierarchies emerged from control over communal rituals. Irving Goffman took this even further, analyzing the ritualism of everyday life. Politeness, greetings, small talk. These mundane interactions function like religious rituals, sustaining social membership and order. He showed how these micro-rituals create class cultures, backstage and frontstage, and even theorized the self not as an internalized viewpoint, but as constituted through successful interaction rituals. Richard Sheff used ultra-refined video and audio analysis to show how micro-coordination in interactions generates feelings of pride and solidarity, while failure leads to shame, motivating conformity. Unresolved shame turns to anger, recycled in gestures, further violating solidarity. Sheff's work beautifully illustrates how the Durkheimian mechanism of solidarity operates at a fine-grained bodily level, shaping emotions, and how breakdowns in this micro-solidarity can fuel conflict. So, wrapping up, we've journeyed through the Durkheimian movement's rise, its struggles in France, its migration to Britain and America, its revival in functionalism, its decline, and its rebirth as microsociology. The core takeaway is that Durkheim wasn't just a lone genius. His work was profoundly shaped by a collective, socially produced process operating on multiple levels. And the insights born from this movement, about social facts, collective consciousness, the power of ritual, and how our thoughts are socially constructed, remain incredibly relevant today, particularly in understanding the intricate dance of everyday interaction and emotion. That's the essence of the Durkheimian legacy.